Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy, a conversation with Amber Manning-Ouellette and Katherine Friesen on finding and sustaining voices in leadership, strategies for women in STEM, with the International Leadership Association. My name is Lisa Endersby, and I'm an educational developer with the Teaching Commons at York University, and also co-editor of Pause for Pedagogy. The ILA and I are thrilled to welcome Amber and Katherine to our latest conversation in the Pause for Pedagogy series. So welcome, Amber and Katherine. We'd love for you each to tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Sure. Well, I'm Katherine Friesen. I'm a PhD candidate here at Iowa State University and an instructor in our Leadership Studies program, and I primarily teach our engineering leadership courses.
And I'm Amber Manning-Ouellette. I'm a lecturer of leadership studies at Iowa State University. And I teach 3 classes a semester in leadership education. One is a civic engagement course where we develop we integrate a service learning project for the class. And then I also teach a capstone research course and a U.S. diversity course introducing different styles of leadership for students, about 12 different theories. And I also direct our Global Leadership Study Abroad program.
Awesome. So a range and wealth of experience we have from both of you to draw on today. That's exciting.
Yes.
So thinking about your article, the first question I have for you is a bit broad, but we're always curious about where these article ideas come from. So what key question or questions were you both hoping to answer in writing this article?
Do you want to, or do you want me to go?
I can go.
Okay.
I think for me, so I teach primarily engineering students, and kind of the key question for me was when I came into the classroom, I didn't have very many women students in the classroom. And so as I was teaching and thinking about reaching my students and thinking about their own learning and development and knowing that they all have different paths, especially when we think about leadership development, I started having questions about how women were experiencing the spaces that they were learning in, how they experienced learning, and then being able to just work with them in a way that was positive and create space for them in the classroom, where oftentimes they were just very quiet in class just because they were looking around and there's not a lot of representation in the classroom. So I think for me, that's where those questions started to arise. And then I met Amber.
Mm-hmm. And I can kind of, piggyback off what she said. This is women's cognitive development has been a research interest of mine for a long time. My PhD is in higher ed administration, and so my dissertation looked at women's cognitive development in terms of like sexual experiences and how women understand their identity. And so part of the reasoning behind looking at women's cognitive development is even looking at my own experience and other women's experience of how I situated my own reality and experiences in silence, or always looking at other people as the expert instead of finding truth in my understanding or knowing. And so I was really intrigued by, if I was experiencing this throughout grade school, middle school, and then into college, is this the experience of other women? And based on research, we know that there are gender frameworks around how genders think and learn. And so it's been kind of this, developing interest of mine. And then really, working with Katie, and we teach a lot of engineering students and specifically women. And so we notice, in male-dominated spaces, women are really understand a lot of their experiences through silence because they don't find confidence or a space that is supportive to their learning environment. So that's really what we wanted to look at within leadership, especially.
Yeah, that makes me think a lot about when both of you were talking about imposter syndrome, and certainly something that I struggle with, and I imagine there are undercurrents of that perhaps in this larger conversation. So of course now I'm thinking about my own experience, but I can certainly recognize how that might be a very similar experience perhaps to a lot of the female students that you're teaching. Interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
So tell me more about the practice or pedagogy that you discuss in your article. Where did the idea or perhaps the need for this work come from?
I can kind of start and then Katie can add to it, but so we talk about 3 strategies in our article, and those are really the practice pieces. And so I think when we talk about strategies, those are in practice applications of how we build confidence in women's voice, especially in male-dominated work or in male-dominated spaces. So the 3 strategies that we cover are helping women build allies, or looking at allyship as a way to strengthen voice, exercising their voice, so putting themselves in uncomfortable spaces where they actually have to project their voice out and practice what that's like. And then also disrupting positive spaces, so identifying injustice or inequities and then finding strength in actually calling those out, or you know, asking questions of why they are experiencing these things to the oppressor or the person that is kind of pushing the injustice on them. And so the other part of the pedagogy, I think, that Katie and I have discussed is that, you know, this is not always formal, it can be informal too. And so the pedagogy in our classrooms, and specifically for me, I teach a service-oriented course of just women in STEM. So it's a leadership education course focused on women in STEM. And so the pedagogy is in the classroom is a supportive space where I challenge them to insert their voice where they normally wouldn't. And then how does that apply out into their male-dominated classes where they don't have as much of a supportive space, but they can transfer the skills they're learning. Anything to add?
Nothing. You did. You got it covered.
Okay. Awesome. So thinking about this in maybe a more, so you talked about some great strategies, and one question that we often get from colleagues who read these series are learning a bit more about the practicality of these practical strategies and thinking about learning outcomes and what you're hoping that students will get out of these experiences. So what were your learning outcomes for this particular practice or the pedagogy, and how did you assess whether these outcomes were met?
Yeah. Well, I think for us, in conjunction with the 3 strategies that Amber talked about, with the first one in identifying allies, for us and our outcomes with our students, it's really important for our students to be able to discern other people's voices and whether those are limiting them and their abilities or whether they're including them. And so recognizing that the people that they are working with, you know, for me, with engineering students, a lot of my engineering students are working on teams. And oftentimes, if there's not a lot of women in the class, they're the only woman represented on the team. And so oftentimes we hear stories about them becoming silenced in those situations and not being able to discern that they are bringing in knowledge and expertise to that team, but they're not necessarily sharing it because the voices that they are hearing are not including them in the content of the team. And so being able to discern that while getting to know people and working with people, I think, was an important outcome of that particular strategy that we use. For the second one, with exercising their voice, we are really asking our students to take risks and putting themselves in uncomfortable situations. And if we think about imposter syndrome, it can be very terrifying to put yourself out there. And so what's nice about the particular course that Amber teaches, where it's all women in STEM majors, that gives them a safe space to think about taking manageable risks. For my students, I have a mix of students in my courses. And so, how do we encourage them to be able to take manageable risks that then slowly build their confidence and help them continue to exercise their voice? So the outcome is really being able to identify risks that they are comfortable with taking in the moment so that they can exercise their voice, and knowing that that development happens over time. They're not going to have one experience where all of a sudden I feel comfortable speaking and sharing my expertise. So really helping them identify that you have to put yourself out there and continue exercising that, and being able to reflect on that is really important. And then the last outcome that we have, positively disrupting spaces, again, is really being able to, especially in the context of leadership, build leadership capacity. So once you recognize, when you're able to discern voices in the room, when you're able to take manageable risks, and pushing our students to think further that you have an opportunity to make space for others, and also to create allyship for other women. And so I think in a leadership context, that brings it back kind of full circle, leadership for the common good. And these women are having these experiences and they're building their voices, and it's creating space for more women, hopefully, women that are also thinking about STEM and coming into a STEM major, and then, basically helping and thinking about the retention of those that come after them.
And I would add, part of our outcomes too is there's formal and informal outcomes. We can see these within assignments and a lot of coursework that we do, but then there are informal ones where we see this just in their growth over their time and working with us. And so I've worked with a woman in particular, sort of a case study where, I offered her a position that she would have never applied for as a student employee, working with me on developing an online course and helping me do some grading of video chats for the online course. From there, I did a little bit of research on learning in the online environment versus the traditional classroom. And then I asked her, would you be interested in doing this? And of course, again, she would have never, asked to do this. Well, she ended up doing research with me, and I pulled her on work on a paper that we actually had published and presented for an organization. And the growth that I've seen in her confidence and what she's capable of is just, it's huge. So I think, there's so many informal outcomes too that we maybe aren't assessing, but we see growth over time. And so leadership really is that vehicle for helping, move this development of confidence and voice.
I really appreciate that framing of thinking about outcomes, not just as these formal things that we assess, but as this real guidepost or sense of guiding post, if you will, for us to think about how growth and development happens in ways that we don't always capture in these more traditional assessment activities. I know in the work that I do here, we talk a lot about learning outcomes, and it's very much knowledge-based or skill-based, which is just as valuable and important. But I appreciate that you're also considering seeing and championing, it sounds like, this unintentional, informal development that happens through the vehicle of leadership, as you talked about. I think that's a piece that we may often see, but don't always document or recognize in the same way because it's not always on our syllabus. That's exciting.
I also think it's with what we're doing, it's not always immediate as well. Development of voice is over our lifespan. It's part of human development. So these are not things that we can assess just through a class. They're over time. And so I think that makes it difficult for us to say concrete, learning outcomes are these, because they are a variety of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, that's probably the case for a lot of subject areas. We talk about individual courses where we support students throughout a 4, 6, 8, 12, 18-week process, but it's not always going to be the case that they achieve every outcome. So I think that at that time, I guess. So the timeliness piece, I think, is really important as well. And thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So thinking about timeliness and over time, wonderful segue that I'm sure was intentional. Where do you see future research or maybe writing headed in this area? What might you be writing about next?
So I can address a little bit of this, and Katie and I really are collaborators on a lot of projects. Actually, so I worked with ACPA and FYE, First Year Experience, and the Student Affairs Organization, and I received a grant to look at women in STEM and the impact that service learning has on them. So I've written some pieces on how does service learning impact their leadership development overall. And so Katie, I've written some work on that, and voice is certainly predominant in how they are developing at an individual values level and a group values level. And so I think, there's lots of extensions off of this. Currently, I'm teaching just the Women in STEM service learning course that's just that group instead of being with other students. And so I think there's some research that can come out of this class as well in terms of social responsibility and voice, and where where are they intervening in social change, and how do they insert their voice into that cycle of social change, into that model of social change. So I think those are some things that I'm thinking about currently, but I think there's a lot more research we can do of leadership development overall in women's voice and what that looks like for different subgroups as well. Because one of the critiques and limitations of looking at the Belinkie model from 1986 is that it doesn't take into account intersectionality and also looking at social capital and the capital that students bring. So it really aligns with human development and gendered human development, but it doesn't necessarily look at subgroups. So I also would like to look at intersectionality of women's leadership and kind of go that route too.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of a little bit of what Amber said, I think because we have this unique partnership on campus and are able to have a class specifically for women in STEM, I think one of our hopes as well is to look at the retention of those women in their major, because the class really targets first-year women. So thinking about how they might be using the course or even our certificate and minor program on campus, how those things might be related to their retention and persistence to graduation. And then I think the ideal world would be, what are they doing after graduation? And how are they using their leadership skills in the job that they're in, and thinking about, the social issues that come with the work that they do and whatnot after graduation. But I think in particular with the class that we have on campus, just being able to see how leadership plays a role in the retention and the persistence of women, and it's a powerful tool, really, to complement their STEM major.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And knowing, as I'm sure it's the case for you and here as well, these notions of retention and persistence have become very important and very timely topics, not just around leadership and not really, well, I guess in some cases around certain students or certain characteristics, but it's very much become a topic of conversation, particularly as students have more choice and more options, or even more pressures in order to stay in a program and work toward graduation. And I appreciate too that you're thinking about life after graduation as well. If for no other reason than selfishly, we get so attached to our students and that student experience that it's also just really interesting to think about what they might be doing and how they might be using those skills once they leave that particular context or environment. So it sounds like you'll be busy for a little while, which is good.
Yeah.
It's good. We need more of this type of conversation and more of this research, I think.
Yeah.
So do either of you have anything else you'd like to add or share about your article or any other comments about the work that you're doing?
I think we love to have these conversations. So I think if people are interested in more of I'd be happy to share the syllabus that I have for especially the Women in STEM class, but also I teach a lot of critical consciousness and leadership education. I identify as a social justice leadership educator. So, we're teaching towards that point of critical consciousness. So I think, I'd be happy to share resources and keep conversations going if someone's really passionate and, this video strikes them as something that they would, they make it all the way through, they listen and they want to continue the conversation. We'd be happy to do that.
Yeah. I would echo that, being able to have conversations about this topic and to support one another and even thinking about the support of our students is really important to me. So just keeping the conversation going.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure there will at least be one or two people who will go to the end of this video and to the end of your article. So I'm sure you'll have some conversations. This is a very timely, important, I think really critical topic of conversation. So I can imagine you'll get a few people who are interested in learning from and working with both of you. So thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Pause for Pedagogy is an initiative of the Leadership Education Member Interest Group of the International Leadership Association. All of our articles and videos are available at www.ila-net.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at @the_ILA. Well, thank you again, Amber and Katherine, and hopefully we'll see you again for another conversation pretty soon.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.